We talked about this last week, but let me reiterate today and realize I say this with zero irony. Donald Trump understands United States foreign policy better than any president of my lifetime. America runs the world economy. We have the greatest military in history. Other countries emulate American pop culture. There's a reason when you go around the world, you hear American music, see American stars in advertisements, and everyone speaks English. America is the global hegemony. Donald Trump gets this at a gut level. And for the first time in my life, an American president isn't afraid to own the fact that we are the only great superpower left on Earth. I'm Tyler Chrestman. Welcome to the Chrestman Conversation. Hello, everyone. We have a fun show for you today. We are going to talk about three topics. We're going to talk about the U.S. defunding USAID, the current state of American tariffs, and the future of the Trump golf course in Gaza. But first, I want to talk to you about my favorite comment from last week. My friend Fred said, "Looks awesome, buddy," in regards to being in Panama. And let me tell you, Fred, you're not wrong. Panama was awesome, and I can definitely recommend it as a tourist destination. It's not really something that I would have thought of prior to booking a trip and going there. It wasn't on the top of my tourism list, but it is a great country, very tourist friendly, at least in the nicer parts of the country, and definitely worth checking out for anyone who has ever thought about taking a vacation. Also, everything around there, because it's based on the American dollar, is actually not too bad price-wise. Even the lodgings, I was looking around a lot of the places. The lodgings aren't bad. The place I was staying was very nice, but a lot of the other hotels and stuff, they're very reasonable down there. It's actually a trip that most people could probably afford if you're looking for somewhere a little different than going to Florida for a vacation. Just putting it out there. It's definitely a fun spot you should check out if you have the means and the opportunity. Anyway, and thanks, Fred, for the well wishes. Hope everything is good with you. Anyway, let's get on with the show. I wanted to start, actually, before we start, this cat is driving me nuts. Look at her. Winnie, why are you like this? Do you have anything to say for yourself? No? No, you're just going to sit there and dig your claws into my leg? That makes sense. That's a very cat-like move of you. Anyway, let's start. We're going to start with the... Now, I've heard a bunch of people saying this different ways. I'm pronouncing it USAID. It's an acronym, okay? Say it however you want, but we're going to start with that today. Prior to this last week, I think it would be a safe assumption to say that most Americans had no idea what USAID was. And now it seems like anyone who is vaguely interested in politics is very aware of this organization. And the reality is that if we were all paying attention, we probably should have been aware of this organization for a long time. What is USAID? Why is it important? Why is everyone up in arms on the Democratic side about its cancellation? Well, the USAID is basically, it stands for the United States Agency for International Development. Okay, sounds good. It's got a very fancy title. Sounds like a good thing. We want other countries internationally to develop. Isn't that nice? But the Democrats are furious that Donald Trump is shutting this organization down, which leads me to believe that it must be a good idea. Because if you're making the worst people in politics, and I'm not talking about Democrats as a whole, but I'm talking about some of the actual players who've come out just furious about this, then it sounds like a good idea to me. So this agency, this government agency, is responsible for administering foreign aid and developmental assistance to different countries around the world. They operate in, I think they have bases in 60 countries, but they operate basically in every country in the world. They have 10,000 employees who are employed by this agency in the government. They have a $50 billion, with a B, dollar budget. And it's true. And when you look into it, this organization, it does some good things. The obvious example that everyone has been using is a lot of this money, not a lot of the money in general, but a lot of money has gone to fighting AIDS in Africa. I think many people would agree that fighting AIDS is a worthwhile endeavor in Africa. It's been a big problem. The reality is, while AIDS is bad, you'll never hear me say otherwise, there are other things we should be spending money on in Africa that would make much more of a difference in the terms of people dying in Africa. But it's good to fight AIDS. AIDS is bad. We don't want people to have AIDS. Okay, so it's a great example. This is the kind of stuff that we think of when we think of foreign aid. Hey, we're going to fight chronic diseases in other countries. And I think many people would say, hey, that's great. We don't want there to be chronic diseases in other countries. We want to use some of our money charitably because we are the global superpower, as I said in the intro, and we want to help other places in the world. And I think a lot of people would say, hey, that's great. However, that's not all this organization does. Now, obviously, a lot of that money is probably going to worthwhile things like fighting AIDS in Africa, malaria, running water, really good projects. But this has also been a organization that has been used to funnel taxpayer money to promote leftist nonsense and basically give giant bags of cash to Democrats throughout the world. And let's bring receipts here. Let's talk examples. Here are some actual things that United States taxpayer dollars have been spent on in the past. $1.5 million to advance DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion in Serbia workplaces. $47,000 on a transgender opera in Colombia. $6 million to fund tourism in Egypt. $50 million for condoms in Gaza. Let's talk about that one just in general. What are $50 million for condoms in Gaza? There's only 1.7 million people who live there right now. What are you talking about? That's insane. Okay, so what are we actually spending that money on? What we're doing is funding terrorism. That's what we're doing with that $50 million to Gaza. How about $2 million for sex changes and LGBT activism in Guatemala? $70,000 to promote a DEI musical in Ireland. $32,000 for transgender comic books in Peru. $2.5 million for electrical vehicles in Vietnam. $37 million to the World Health Organization, which is just a giant waste of money, and a funnel to China. Hundreds of millions of dollars in Afghanistan for the Taliban. Should we be funding the Taliban? Hey, remember the 20 years we spent fighting a war against these guys? How about we just give them hundreds of millions of dollars, which is what's happened. Now, the U.S. is saying, well, that's going to be used to build canals and irrigation and do all this stuff. The Taliban controls the country. They run the gun. There is no Afghanistan government other than the terrorists who run it, and we're giving them hundreds of millions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money. On top of the billions of dollars worth of equipment that we left them as a gift when Joe Biden decided to disastrously pull out of the country, that's another story. And this is on top of the other hundreds of thousands of dollars that have been gone to organizations that are linked to terrorism throughout the world. Things like CARE, things like the Muslim Student Alliance, all these things that the government gives money to that then just gives them to terrorist front because they're terrorist front groups. So hundreds of thousands and hundreds of millions of dollars to terrorism that the U.S. is funding against itself. That doesn't sound very bright to me. Every one of these dollars is coming at the expense of the American taxpayer. I'm all for being charitable. I really am. I think charity is a good thing. I think it's good to give money to causes that you believe in. I'm not for using, for example, someone else's money to give charity for something I support. Hey, if you support a DEI musical in Ireland or a transgender comic book in Peru, that's great. I'm not going to tell you shouldn't do that. I think it's stupid, but you could do whatever you'd like. If you want to give money to that project, start a GoFundMe. Start a Kickstarter, whatever the people use these days. Feel free to donate, but you don't get to use my money to donate to your leftist nonsense. And that is exactly what this organization is doing. Hundreds of millions of dollars to causes we should not be funding, and every one of those dollars is coming from the American taxpayer. We're going through the worst inflation we've had in 40 years. We need to tamp down on our spending, and Donald Trump did a great job. As I said, there are 10,000 employees in this organization, and Donald Trump has whittled it down to 200 and something. He suspended all of them, and I think they're going to shutter many of these places, and most of those employees should be fired. We don't need you. See you later. It's important to remember, by the way, so people who are upset about this, it is very important to remember that when polled, 6 in 10 adults think that we spend too much on foreign aid. This is according to the Associated Press. They did a poll, and that includes 9 in 10 Republicans and 55% of Democrats. 7 in 10 adults think that we spend too much on foreign aid when you get into specifics. So 70% of the American population, when actually told what we're spending money on, think we spend too much. Donald Trump is just enacting the will of the American people, and the Democrats are furious about it because the Democrats do not care about what the people want. The people wanted Donald Trump. The people want Donald Trump's agenda. Donald Trump's agenda is based on what the people want. It goes back and forth. 7 in 10 adults, 70% of America can't agree on anything. But 7 in 10 Americans know we spend too much on foreign aid. Donald Trump is washing that clean, and this is great. This is wonderful. This is what people elected Donald Trump to do. They realize nobody, I really don't even know, maybe some of the stricter libertarians, but most Republicans even are not opposed to foreign aid. I'm not opposed to foreign aid. I'm really not. As you just heard me say a second ago, I believe that we should use our money. If we're going to be the global superpower, it is our job to make sure the world functions properly. But you have to understand the world doesn't work the way the United States world. The world is full of graft and corruption. You see that in the United States, like people like Bob Menendez, but those guys, they eventually go to prison. You can be a little shifty and a little shady and a little on the edge. Someone like Nancy Pelosi, who made millions and millions of dollars off stock trading while being on a bunch of committees that have to do with the American stock market. So it's like, or that have to do with companies that are in the stock market, I should say. You can be that. Okay. That's a little different than straight up bribery and theft, which happens in a lot of other countries. We talked about this in regards to Panama, but it happens all over the world. What it does is we ship $50 million for condoms in Gaza, and they're not spending $50 million on condoms. They're spending $50 million on whatever the hell they want. They're not spending hundreds of millions of dollars in Afghanistan on a canal. They're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to prop up their military and enrich the pockets of the warlords in charge. That's what happens around the world. When you ship money to Africa to help Africans, a lot of it is intercepted by whoever the toughest guy is with the most guns. And that's just the way it works around the world. So what I don't want to do is use American taxpayer dollars to fund nonsense leftist projects, which I don't agree with, like funding DEI and transgenderism throughout the world. I don't think that's a worthwhile cause we should be spending money on. Or it's corruption and graft at a level that we can't understand, because most people, when they retire, they might have $1 million, $2 million in their bank after 70 years of working. But they don't understand the concept of $100 million or $1 billion or $60 billion. They don't understand this. They'll never achieve that. No one will. No one except Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. And so it's hard for them to grasp how much graft there is in the world. And it's great that we want to help people, and we should. We should fight AIDS in Africa, but every dollar should be accounted for, and every dollar should go to funding that cause, not making a bunch of people rich and employing a bunch of useless idiots who don't do anything productive except leech off the American taxpayer. That's not our job. So I'm all for this. I think it's great, and let's hope more cuts are coming around. You know what we need? We need, like, I'm going to change one of these buttons on this little thing over here to sound of like scissors cutting. And whenever Donald Trump cuts something, we'll get out some scissors and we'll just go. We'll have like a celebratory theme. It'd be great. And because I'm all for it. I think we spend too much money. Cutting government spending is the future of the American economy. If we have a future, it's going to be at the expense of all the nonsense we spend money on. It's the only way. Otherwise, we're going to go bankrupt. It's just the way it is. You cannot beat that prediction. It's not going to work. You either cut spending or we go bankrupt. This is a great first step. Let's keep it rolling. Moving on into topic 2. Tariffs. We've talked about tariffs. I've kind of explained tariffs, and I've told you they're not always the right thing, because they do, in the short term, raise prices for Americans. That's just the way it works. It's hard to explain how tariffs work without understanding that they are going to raise prices, but that is not necessarily terrible for the economy. We're not going to get into all the tariff stuff, but I want to talk about America's tariff policy right now today. So Donald Trump, let me explain the way he views tariffs, because I feel like many people don't understand this. He looks around the world. Donald Trump is looking at his globe. He's looking at the income. He's looking at the imports. He's looking at the exports. He's looking at the dollar signs. He's looking at other countries. He looks around the world, and what he sees is that people leech off of the United States. Once again, they take advantage of the American taxpayer. And when they do that, Donald Trump is now using tariffs to force them to address issues. So I have examples here. Let's talk our two of our closest trading partners, Canada and Mexico. You might know them. Canada is our evil neighbors to the north. Mexico is our incompetent neighbor to the south. And I say this with love to my Mexican friends. The government in Mexico does a terrible job because they're at a disadvantage. They are fighting a military force within their own country known as the cartel. And it's very difficult in Mexico to combat the cartel because the cartel makes more money than the Mexican government, and the cartel is more well equipped than the Mexican government. They are fighting a war, and it's difficult because the cartel will straight up murder you. And so it's hard to take a stand, what would it be? The bravery it is required in Mexico is different than in America. In America, I can sit here and I can criticize the cartel. I can say, I think they're bad. I think they're evil, blah, blah, blah. And I'm fine. In Mexico, if I take that same stance, there's a possibility that I wind up with my head cut off, because that's what happens in Mexico when you go against the cartel, especially. And they do this to elected officials, not just random podcasters on the street. So it's different in Mexico. Donald Trump is looking at our trading partners, Canada and Mexico, and he is saying they are not doing their job, whatever he thinks that is. And in this case, I'm talking about the border. And so Donald Trump comes out and he says, listen, Mexico and Canada, they're not doing their job. They are allowing drugs to pour into America. They are allowing Americans to be poisoned. They don't police the borders the way that America does. They just expect America to do this job by itself. We share a border. Do your fair share. He comes out and he says, I'm putting a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico. And let's explain this too. Because America is a gigantic country, what are we, the fourth or fifth biggest country in the world by landmass and population? It's ridiculous how many people live in America, how big this country is. We take it for granted. I think it goes, Russia is the biggest, and then it might be Canada, actually, but most of Canada is uninhabited. It's just frozen wasteland in the north. It's Russia, Canada, U.S., China, Brazil. I think those are the top 5 in terms of size. I could be wrong. It could be totally off. I think that's it. But we're in the top 5. We're in the top 5 for the biggest country. It means we have gigantic borders, north and south. They're not doing their job. Donald Trump comes, he put a tariff on them. The reason why this doesn't work the way many people are pretending it does, like Donald Trump comes, he says, Canadian imports, 25% tariff. What that means is when you import something, I'm going to pay an additional 25% tax on this item. Well, imagine, just pick something. Because we're talking about Canada, I import hockey sticks. Okay? So I bring a hockey stick in from Canada. I have to pay an additional 25% on this hockey stick. Well, what do I do as a person who sells hockey sticks? I can now look around because, let's say, just make the numbers easy. The hockey stick, which is not how much they cost, but the hockey stick costs $100. And I now import it from Canada, and it costs me $125 to import it because it was costing me $100. Now it's $125 because it's additional 25% tax. Well, there's a place in America that makes hockey sticks, but the hockey sticks are always more expensive. They cost $112. Well, now what do I say? Well, why would I import from Canada when I can look around and I can say, well, I can actually make this in America now cheaper than I can buy it in Canada because of the tax. And so what happens is could be in the long term good for American businesses, but in the short term you feel the price because the price just went up $12. Well, that hockey stick that I have now made in America employs Americans and gives American workers jobs, and now they have more spending money, and now it potentially could be good for the economy in the long run. Or maybe I just import from a different country. Canada's a problem, so I say, oh, they actually make hockey sticks in wherever. They actually, ignoring the problem for a second, they make them in Mexico. And I can actually just import them from Mexico for $102 or $100 from Mexico when I was just doing it from Canada. Because the United States is so large, because we import from so many countries, the prices won't go up like they think. But Canada has a problem because Canada doesn't just sell things all around the world. The American market is such a gigantic share of every other country's economy that if you can't import to America or people won't import from you, your country is in serious trouble. So what happens? Donald Trump says, I'm going to tariff you, Canada. I'm going to tariff you, Mexico, if you don't do what I want you to do, which is police your border, send more troops, invest in infrastructure, whatever the case may be. And it could be about anything. I'm just using the border as an example because we're talking about Canada and Mexico in this particular case. And then what happens? Canada says, well, if you tariff us, we're going to tariff you right back. We can be tough. But then they look at it and say, oh, guess what? We account for almost nothing of the American economy. We're not a giant market for them. They have a $30 trillion economy, and they sell things all over the world because we're America, and everyone wants to buy our stuff, and we sell stuff, and that's the way it works. We don't need the Canadian economy. We don't. We could blink them out of our existence, and it would be fine. So then Canada's faced with the problem because they realize they actually can't play tough with us because we don't need them. They need us. Same with Mexico. Mexico has a $3 trillion economy. We have a $30 trillion economy. We don't need Mexico. We can get cheap goods from everywhere else. We can make things in America. We don't need them. They absolutely need us. They need us to buy their stuff because we are their market. So what happened? Canada and Mexico both folded. They both came out, they talked tough, and then they blinked, and Donald Trump won. What did Donald Trump win? Well, the president of Mexico, Miss Claudia Sheinbaum, both her and Trudeau, they decided to play nice. Mexico's going to send 10,000 guards to the border to help with the U.S. police illegal crossings. Canada is going to spend $1.3 billion on new border enforcement. That includes sending 10,000 more people to the border for policing and more resources on the northern border in general. So Donald Trump wins. And he can do this with every country, by the way, because every country that he threatens, that they say, you're taking advantage of America, this is the way you use tariffs. This is how Donald Trump uses tariffs. He's not looking just to put a tax on all imports. He's not a protectionist in that sense. But what he is he's using tariffs for leverage against these countries so that they will start paying their fair share. It shouldn't be up to the U.S. alone to stop people from illegally crossing in from Canada. It shouldn't be on the U.S. alone to stop that from Mexico. Do your part. Control the border. And he uses this, and this is just a specific example of him doing this, but he's doing this in many cases. This is why tariffs can work. We can use our power, use our might to force other countries to do what we want them to do. There are countries that take advantage of the U.S. taxpayer all over the world. Europe and Canada in particular, I can name one big one. People will talk about this. Metoprolol, a drug used to control blood pressure. They'll say, oh my gosh, this drug cost me $100, whatever the case is. I can go across the border to Canada and this drug only costs $20. I can go to Europe, and this drug only costs $24. American drug companies are costing Americans because they jack up the prices in America. Let me explain something to you. Europe, in their single-payer healthcare systems, in Canada, in its single-payer healthcare systems, use America's generosity to take advantage of America. America, the reason why you pay more for drugs is not because the drug companies in America are so mean and evil. It's because other countries around the world force drug companies to pay a lower cost. And the drug companies will do that to maintain the market in those companies while using America to fund their research and development. So the drug, let's imagine that America says to Canada and it says to Europe, you are not going to do this. You're not going to force the drug companies to pay a lower cost because then America foots the bill. That drug that costs you $100 and costs the Canadian $12, really that drug should probably be $35 to $40 for everybody. But Canada's paying a lower cost and you're paying a higher cost because that's how the company is making up their money. And people will say, oh my God, Tyler, if the Canadians can buy it for $12, then Americans could buy it for $12. And that would also just solve the problem. And those big greedy pharmacy companies would have to deal with it and blah, 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 blah. No, you don't understand what you're talking about. America funds the research and development of all the drugs in almost all of the pharmaceutical companies. Every medical patent in the world, almost, comes out of America. And the reason why that's the case is because we pay more for drugs. Imagine that we went the other way. And we're not doing what I say, which is forcing Canada to pay their fair share. What we do is we drop ours down and we say we're also going to pay what Canada pays. Well, what happens then? The drug money companies, the money that all these drug companies make, it starts to dissipate. And you'll say, well, their profits are gigantic. They use that profit to fund their research and development. This is how new drugs get made. This is how medical advancements get made. This is not just about funding some CEO who wants to make $100 million a year. I don't care about that guy. What I care about is the drugs that work and the research that's done. It takes 10 years to get a drug through FDA screening. It is so expensive. You could never do it. I could never do it. I don't have the money to fund 10 years worth of FDA mandated research to get drugs on the market. This is how the world takes advantage of America. Europe does the same thing as Canada. They force drug companies to sell low so that they make a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of profit. And you say, well, if they could do it there, they could do it here. It doesn't work that way. Canada should be paying more money. Europe should be paying more money. They're taking advantage of Americans. It's not the other way around. We are funding drugs for Canada, for Europe, for the rest of the world with our drug prices. Donald Trump looks at this. He understands this. Other countries, you look at them and you say, well, they have it so nice over there. Look at their drug prices. And Donald Trump says, that's because you're doing it. This is what he means by America first. This is how you use tariffs. Use tariffs to get people to play fair and stop taking advantage of America's generosity. He can do this with the border. He could do this with drug prices. He could do this with whatever he wants. We run the world. It's important to understand that. America runs the world, and they need us more than we need them. That's just the way it is. And I hope that this continues. I hope that he keeps on. All these leaders are forced to play nice with him because they talk tough. And then the day that tariff is supposed to go into effect, he signs the executive action that says, hey, here you go. They blink. You're playing chicken with a guy who is in a tank, and he doesn't need to turn, and you have to. It's like that old Daniel Tosh bit where he said, if poker's a sport, it should be in the Olympics, but you only get to play with your country's net worth. And he said, it looks like Costa Rica's all in with 13 coconuts, and the U.S. is like, yeah, we'll call. That's what we're doing right now. We're playing poker with all these other ones. But they can see our hand. They can see our giant stack of chips and realize that you can't go all in against us because we'll call. Donald Trump is the kind of guy, he will call your hand. He will call your bluff. And they're realizing that. And it's so early. It's so early in this administration for him to be doing this stuff, and it's working. And let's just keep hoping it goes that way because it works. Anyway. Let's talk about, this is just a brief one because this is it's complicated and it's in the early stages and we don't know where it's going to go. But Donald Trump mentioned this week that he wants the U.S. to take over Gaza. And watch the press conference, and just look at Benjamin Netanyahu's face when he's doing this. And you could tell, I don't know if he was totally on board with this. It seems like everyone's surprised by this. I haven't heard any politician say anything about this as a possibility. What I've said from the beginning should happen is that there should be a demilitarized zone in Gaza, and you basically just don't let anyone live in this giant border along Israel. And I thought that seemed like the most likely solution. This is what is the word? This is a wild idea, and I don't quite know how I feel about it. I have said for the longest time, there is no two-state solution. There is not. There has basically been a second state since 2005. 2005 or 2008? 2005. 2005, when Israel left Gaza, there has been a state. It's been run by Hamas, and it is a terrorist haven that has done nothing for its citizens and just forces people to live in abject misery with the entire direction of using all the money they receive to fund terrorism to destroy Israel. You can't have a state. The Palestinians have demonstrated they are not ready to have a state. And let's be honest, the Palestinians are not a real group of people. Historically, it's never been a country. It's not. It was at different points part of Egypt and part of Lebanon, but there's never been an independent Palestinian state. And in the last 20 years, since they were granted this without the official title, this idea of statehood in Gaza, they have done nothing for their people. They have done nothing productive and added nothing to the world in that time. It's just the way it is. There's not a lot of innovation coming out of that area. The idea that the United States should take it over had not occurred to me as a real idea. There are going to be people who call this an ethnic cleansing. I don't know. The problem is that Egypt and Lebanon and Jordan, none of these countries want the Palestinians. Egypt shares a border with Gaza. They kept their gates locked this entire time. They do not want the Palestinians in their country because they recognize that the people are radical. They just are. Look at there was a video that was released of one of the Jewish hostages in Gaza being marched down the street. This was just last week. What you had was thousands of people in the street cheering about this. No one was upset. Everyone was glad that there was a Jew who was being marched through the streets, and it was basically a parade of people yelling and throwing things and torture. The people in Gaza have not demonstrated an ability to peaceably cohabitate with their Jewish neighbors. So the idea that the U.S. should take it over is interesting. I don't know if it's feasible, but it is an interesting idea at least. It's different because let me tell you, there is no Palestinian state. There is not going to be a two-state solution. Anyone advocating for a two-state solution does not understand the situation on the ground. They haven't read a book. I got books on the shelf here. One by Alan Dershowitz and one by Benjamin Netanyahu. Those are the two I can think of off the top of my head. Both of them basically say that the Israel has a right to exist. It has a historical and a legal case for the land that they occupy. The Palestinians cannot make the same claim. They just can't. And there's not a legal thing that says if you attack someone that you just get to go back to status quo. If you lose a war, which is what's happened, they started a war, they lost the war, there's nothing that says that everything just has to go back to the way it was and you get to try again later, which is all that's ever happened. So should we take it over? I don't know. I'm not 100% sure on this yet. I've never considered it as a possibility. It's great land. If Hamas had used the hundreds of millions of dollars, probably billions of dollars in aid they've gotten over the last 20 years to build that land up, it's on the Mediterranean. It's coastline. It's great property. It could be like Tel Aviv, but they haven't. And if the U.S. had it, I mean, maybe we could do something with it. And actually, I made a joke in the intro about the Trump golf course and resort, the Gaza golf course. I mean, it could be a nice place. Look at its location. Donald Trump loves real estate. He's all about taking it over. That's why we're taking Greenland. That's why we're taking back the Panama Canal. Maybe we'll just take Gaza. And this is what empire does. We're an empire. And I used to think that was kind of an embarrassing fact when I was younger and more of an isolationist. And now I embrace it. Now I think if it's not us, then who's it going to be? And who would be better than us? No one. It's going to be us. It's going to be China. It's going to be Russia. It's going to be somebody else. And it should be us because we're better. We're a more moral country than China. We're a more moral country than Russia. And we don't, despite being able to, we don't actually just enslave the countries that we take over. We were in Iraq. We were in Afghanistan. The lives of the people in Afghanistan were better when America was there than when the Taliban's there. The lives of people in Iraq they were better when America was there as opposed to when we're gone. And so the lives of the people who choose to live in Gaza would be better if America was there instead of if Hamas is there. So I am a firm believer in that all around the world. And we'll see. Who knows? This might not go anywhere. So that's why we're not spending too much time on it. Anyway, we're going to leave it there for the day. As always, questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the comments below, preferably on YouTube or Rumble, where they're easier for me to get to. I don't go on Facebook all that often. I do to check on the comments, but Facebook's the worst. YouTube is much easier from a creator standpoint to interact with and gives you a lot more data and actually is helpful. Same with Rumble. Rumble is great. Rumble is actually the only platform, by the way, that I get paid on. So that's pretty nice, too, whenever somebody uses Rumble to act on stuff. The only problem with Rumble is that the comments sometimes are hard to get to. They'll send an email, and it's a whole thing. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter from your perspective. YouTube and Rumble are definitely the ones that I appreciate when people comment on the most, just because of the way that it works and the algorithm helps me the most. Anyway, you don't care about any of that. Leave me a comment wherever you want. Wherever you watch the video. It doesn't really matter to me. I appreciate all of them. Anyway, I will catch you guys next Friday. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next episode.